Hi, folks. Nick here, and welcome into this special subseries of Flourish FM on anti-fragility. Throughout the course of our discussions with experts from around the world on various topics related to human flourishing, one consistent theme comes up time and time again, and that is kind of the willingness to say yes to or engage in unpleasant or sometimes adverse or air quotes negative experiences. So we decided to dive into this topic a little bit more deeply by chatting with some people from our lives that are highly successful, live what we think are anti-fragile lives, happen to be kind of just parents, right? Family people, living sort of the normal existence as well, and really see what we can learn from them about the lived experience of anti-fragility, the ability to not just bounce back from adverse scenarios, but actually grow from it, and maybe in some cases even thrive through it, or at least because of it. Today, I'm excited to bring you a conversation with Kawika Lau. Kawika is a really extraordinary individual, like everyone we're talking to in this series here. Kawika, in 2014, retired from the U.S. Army after 21 years of service, where he served various roles, various locations, perhaps most prominently in counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, where he suffered, I think, an incredibly traumatic and life-changing, but I think also in some ways meaningful event for him. And our conversation today centers around that. Kawika's sort of personal philosophy, as well as the science and the research he's learned and gathered throughout a career thinking about service and purpose and community and peak performance, and all the sorts of things I think we come to often associate with the notion of anti-fragility. So long story short, Kawika's, I think, life, the way he parents his 3 children, the way he thinks about existing in the world is just a really, really great demonstration of a lot of what we talk about on the show as a whole, and certainly have been digging into this anti-fragility subseries. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Kawika Lau. Okay, so Kawika, let's dive right in. I've given, obviously, our listeners a little bit of your bio, but I'd love if we just start, just give us kind of a quick summary of your background, because I think that's going to help set some obvious context for our conversation around anti-fragility and why I wanted to chat with you.
Okay. So my name is Kawika Lau. My background professionally started when I was 17 and a half and I joined the military. I am an ethnic Hawaiian, and as such, I was raised in a traditional Hawaiian way. And if you've ever been to the state of Hawaii, we're very proud of our warrior roots. There's a warrior ethos among the Native Hawaiians, and that's kind of how I was raised. So although we have a sordid past with the United States, because Hawaii at one time we were a kingdom, nonetheless, within my family, we have a proud tradition of military service that goes back to World War II. My grandfather was on Pearl Harbor the day that the Japanese attacked.
Oh, wow.
There's a town called Waimanalo, and he had a little farm there, and he was actually delivering some of his farm goods to the base when the attack happened. And he helped out as much as he could. He, used his little farm truck to move wounded sailors around. But the effects of that day left him so in awe of American bravery that he made a family rule that stands to this day. Mind you, my grandfather on my dad's side, he immigrated here, so he barely spoke English, right? He married my grandmother, who was one of the last full-blooded Hawaiians that had to learn English. She only spoke Hawaiian. So together they could only communicate in this possibly elementary English. That was their only, that's why that's where like the pidgin language comes from, right? So my dad and all of his siblings, there was 11 of them. They come up, the only language that their mom and dad could communicate in was a very broken English because they didn't have that much formal education.
Where did he immigrate from?
China.
Gotcha. Okay, cool.
Kamchu Winkit Lao. So
okay.
He's a fresh immigrant, and the effects of that day, by the time he made it home, right, everyone's at the house like, is he dead too? Because they know what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
by the time he made it home, he was not so much shaken, but he was just in awe of the bravery that he saw in that moment. And he made a rule. He said, as long as the Lau family, lives in the United States, every generation has to produce one child for military service forever. And in his mind, that's how he was going to pay this country back for taking him in. Even though my grandma had always been here, right? So from the time that I can understand language, my dad would tell me, he was like, you've done nothing to earn your U.S. citizenship. He's like, that was given to you. He said,
Mm.
but the day's going to come when you've got to ante up and, you've got to do your best to earn it. And so, I was told when I was young, your future lies, whatever you do, your path goes through the military because that's what we do. Like, that's how we're gonna keep paying this country back for taking your grandfather in. So, by the way, we were 7 kids in a 2-bedroom, 900 square foot house. So I was ready. First thing I asked my dad was, I was like, 'cause I didn't have my own bed. I said, will I get my own bed? He said, yeah, they'll feed you too. I'm ready to go right now. I'm in the third grade. Sign the papers, pops. I'm ready.
Military or a bunch of siblings? Easy
Yeah,
choice, huh?
I don't have to elbow my way in for food. Let's go.
It's great. It's great. So you join at 17.
Yep. I joined and loved it. It was everything I thought it would be. This was pre 9/11, so there's really, there's nothing going on. So I served 6 years active in the scout platoon, get out. I'm doing federal law enforcement at this time down on the southwest border. And then 9/11 happens. And of course I want to be involved. And so I re-enlist in the reserves, get a deployment, actually, but I don't get sent to Iraq, right, or Afghanistan. Like there's a need for me to go to Kosovo on a peacekeeping mission. And I fought it tooth and nail. I was like, you got to be kidding me. Like, you're sending me to Kosovo and I'm sure it's worthwhile, but there's an actual fighting war going on. So I went kicking and screaming and ended up being one of the best, trips I ever made. I met my wife on that deployment, and
Mm.
we have 3 kids to this day. So come back, switch gears. I go to a selection course to join special forces, go to 19th Special Forces Group, which is a guard SF group. And I also switched jobs to a different federal agency. I go up to the Pacific Northwest and work with this unit. That they were very good. I grew a lot there. That unconventional force, so they were big on training the mind, training the body. There was required reading list to be in that unit. They were very big on holistic training, right? Like of course, you got to be strong, swift, lethal, and deadly, but you also have to have a deep intellectual, you have to have a moral compass. You have to be able to think through problems. You have to know history. And I wish
Mm.
every occupation was like that, but they really invested in your intellectual development and your ability to think
Mm.
creatively, because when you're in an organization like that, you're planning your own missions a lot of times. And you're operating in environments where conventional rules may not apply. So your moral compass has to be very, very calibrated. So then I deployed with those guys. And then about 8 months into that deployment, I got hit by a suicide bomber. I was leading a joint U.S. and Afghan patrol, and 13-year-old male walked into our patrol wearing 25 pounds of Semtex wrapped around his skinny torso. That's a commercial grade explosive. That's a massive, massive suicide vest that was covered in ball bearings, which were also impregnated with poison, right? So, and bomber walked in, and that's a whole long story, but he walked into patrol and detonated, and it was a fight for life for the next 5-6 hours. Everybody in my patrol was either dead or try not to be dead. We lost a lot of people that day. We lost some good Americans. We lost some outstanding Afghans. A lot of civilians died. So that was the for a lot of us involved in that day, not just myself. For a lot of us, that was the bifurcation of time, right? Like that event. I mean, we had been into a lot of things before that, but that singular event is how a lot of us mark time. There was our lives before that event, and there's our lives
Mm.
after that event.
What are some of the major ways it changed for you before and after? I want to come back and rewind and double click on a lot of different things you've mentioned, but since you've brought
Yeah.
us here, what do you think some of the major shifts were looking back? Remind me the year this was again?
That was April 4th, 2012.
2012. Okay.
Yeah.
It's been about a decade.
It's crazy. It's one of those that is the most vivid memory in my mind. I can close my eyes. I can remember the litter falling out of the sky. I can remember how it smelled. I can remember everything. It is the most vivid memory, which is crazy because I lost a lot of my memory. Like I had a significant traumatic brain injury, so portions of my memory were completely wiped clean. Things I used to be able to do were just wiped right off the hard drive. But that
Mm,
memory is seared into my mind. And it's funny, it was explained to me because I was in TBI clinic for 3 years at Brooke Army Medical Center. So I'm with neurologists every day for 3 years, and they're explaining to me because that is where it can get scary and confusing is when your brain gets that badly damaged, you don't know what it is that you forgot, but you know that there's these blank spaces in your brain. Or
sure.
people would be having conversations and you would think, man, I used to know a lot about this, and you want to jump into the conversation, but you don't because you can't recall anything. And
Mm,
your grasp of language, I had to learn how to speak again. Your grasp of language is changed as well. Like you lose a lot of vocabulary. So that is what can be frightening for a lot of people that go through these TBI because they know something's off, but they can't understand, what's going on. So, these large chunks of my memory were gone, but that memory of that event and the hours after that were just vivid, crystal clear. And one of my neurology docs explained to me that it's a survival mechanism. She said, when you're in these situations where your brain feels like we might not make it out of this, she said it will work in hyperdrive to capture every sight, every sound, every smell, and it will physically encode those in the deeper folds of your brain to protect it from concussion. Like it writes it down in there.
mm,
She said the context of that memory may be skewed, but the biological markers are going to be seared into your brain forever. She said that's why she goes, this might happen to you. It could be years later. You could be out somewhere. And for me, this happened, and I was at an Oktoberfest with some buddies. She said, you might be out somewhere and something from that day is going to trigger your brain. A sight, a sound, a smell, and you might break out into a cold sweat and you don't know what's going on. She's like, I'm telling you right now, you're not going crazy. She goes, something was in that environment that reminded your brain of something that almost killed you. And it goes right to the amygdala. She goes, it has no time to explain the prefrontal cortex. It has no time for rationalization. The mechanism in your brain for survival basically says, hey, that thing that almost killed us, it might be back. Cortisol, adrenaline, go. Boom, it's going to pump into your system. And it
sure.
doesn't explain the prefrontal cortex. So just, going through this process of healing the brain, right? Like trying to learn, and everything's happening at the same time. I mean, I was a patient in the hospital for 3 years. About 6 of those months I was inpatient. Right there, I almost lost my right leg at the hip and my left leg at the knee. So I'm going through limb salvage, brain's trying to heal, still trying to make sense of, I lost a lot of friends. And by the way, I
Sure.
was in charge. I'm the patrol leader. Everybody that was there because I picked that route, I picked that time, and they felt comfortable and safe, going outside the wire with me. They wanted to be with me. And every one of those men that died had kids. And one of them, Captain Nicholas Rosansky, he had a daughter born when we were on that deployment. And he could have went back for her birth, but he stayed, and he never got to hold his daughter in this world. So there's just a lot of things during that time that can drive you crazy, especially when you're immobilized. I mean, I was completely bedridden. And even though you're still in and out of consciousness and it's hard to have lucid thoughts. When you do have lucid thoughts, naturally those thoughts gravitate towards that moment. And um, everything that we lost on that day. And I think that's where a lot of people start to get in trouble
What
because
do you mean?
because when you're in that, for me, it was this process of I should have been killed, right? Like I was the closest person to that bomb that lived, and everyone around me, even some people further away from me, they died, right? So when people have survivor's guilt a lot of times when they go when they do something like this, and then it's okay. You go through this thing where there's this novelty of being alive, right? You're like, oh my God, I'm alive. Like, I can't believe it. And then that novelty of being alive somehow, for me, it crossed over into survivor's guilt. Like, yeah, I am alive. And these men who trusted me, right, who were following me, they're not alive. And then there's a lot of second guessing and doubt. Is there anything that I could have done better? Is there something that I missed? Could I picked a different route? And for for a lot of guys, the hardest thing to do, harder than any physical recovery, is forgiving yourself, right? Is like, because there's a part of you that doesn't think that you deserve to be let off that hook. And one of my best friends, he was actually my partner on that deployment, and also my boss. But I remember, like, right before he came to see me when you go through this, and I'm leaving a lot out for time's sake.
Okay.
I was actually mistaken as an Afghan in the aftermath. I tourniqueted my own legs, but I had longer hair and a mustache. And there's an ethnicity. Afghanistan is a very ethnically fractured society, but there's an ethnicity that are Hazara, and they look like me, right? They're children of Genghis Khan. They have very Asian
Okay.
features. I
Okay.
would I would be mistaken as a Hazara all the time. So I think they thought I was a Hazara, and but if they thought I was an Afghan, they put me in the back of a truck. Afghan
Oh, wow.
civilians took me to their hospital, which they're doing the best they can, but there's no health care going on in there. And I was on my own for a while. I eventually made my way to a Norwegian camp in the back of a taxi cab by myself. But so the process goes from, I'm alive, yes, I'm alive, to wait a minute, yeah, I'm alive, but I lost a lot of people, and is it right that I'm alive and they're not? And oh, by the way, this is on me, right? Because, like, I'm in charge. So before they flew me out of country, because you go through this medevac route, that's where I was getting to. Um, and eventually I was in Bagram Air Base, and when you're stable enough to be flown out from there, they would fly you to Landstuhl, typically in Germany. And then when you're able to cross the Atlantic, they fly you to the East Coast of the United States. And I remember I was in Bagram, and I'm awake, and I'm just like, I know who died, I know who didn't make it, and my boss came to see me before I flew off, and he's just sitting there, and we're holding hands. I think we're just crying together, and he's checking on all the guys that are there. And I looked at him, and I remember saying, I said back, I'm like, is this on me? Did I F something up? Are all these guys dead because of me? And he basically looked at me, and he was like, how dare you say that? And he said, Kawika, he goes, what would you tell me if I was laying in that bed, and you're here, and I'm laying in that bed blaming myself? I said, I would tell you, Matt, this is war. Like, this is somehow, we're very diligent in our planning, but things go down like this sometimes. And then right away I realized what he had done. You know, he goes, you can't say this to yourself. So it was a longer process than that, but that's what gets some people in trouble, is they stay in this place of deep survivor's guilt, and the mind and heart navigate the body, and the body's never going to follow where the mind and heart willing to lead. And that and other things will hamper their physical recovery, right? The mindset drives the physical recovery. Positivity and optimism drive the physical recovery.
So can we dive into that more deeply here? Because I think, first of all, thank you for sharing all of this, right? Obviously, I've heard the story a couple times before, given our sort of previous relationship, but I really appreciate you kind of putting it out there for the audience here. It's an amazing story. I'm kind of blown away every time I hear it. What stands out to me as we're talking about it this time around is whenever we lay out the term anti-fragility, some people can get it confused with just like suck it up and be mentally tough, never
Mhm.
experience anything unpleasant, right?
Yes.
And I want to hold that up, and then I want to put something next to it, which is anyone I think that's ever had the good opportunity to get to know you experiences you in exactly the way you just described. Very positive, upbeat. If you want to put loose language on it, happy, right? Optimistic, kind of willing to say yes, willing to jump in, willing to have a go, right? Excited about the things you're doing. And for our usual audience, like you, oh, seems like Kawika's flourishing, right? But
Yes.
everything you've shared so far is, excuse my language, effing miserable on some level. And you've talked a little bit about being able to, I think, exist in those states and hold them and navigate them, but not get stuck in them.
Mhm.
I have two questions most immediately. Number one, do I have that summary right? And number two, how? And then
Yes.
I'm wondering if that's going to pull us back into your childhood and your history and service and community and purpose. But just, do we have it right? And what would you say about the how part?
Yeah, that's accurate.
Okay.
And I think the how, I this is just from an unscientific survey of one myself,
Mm-hmm.
right? The how, there's a lot of different methods, but it's all the same principles. It's going to be principle based. So I have no doubt, like I have experienced anti-fragility. I'm in the post-traumatic growth trajectory
Yeah.
without a doubt. So I'll just share with you some of my observations and how me and other people like me that I was going through with this at the time achieved it, because not everybody does. First of all, I think we are working, and this is why I'm so glad that you're out there doing this, right? Because there's not a lot of voices like yours out there talking about this as a possibility.
Mm.
So I teach all over the world, and I still get to train law enforcement. I still train military. And if you walk into a room, any place on the planet, full of not just combat veterans or straight boiled cops, but anybody, and you walk into the room and you say, somebody finish this phrase, post traumatic, everyone's going to shout out stress.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody shouts out growth,
Growth. Yeah.
even though humans have been experiencing this, right, ever since we've been walking the earth. And that term post-traumatic growth, I believe it entered into the lexicon in like the late 1980s, but people have been experiencing it as long as we've been going through stuff.
Sure.
The challenge is, and this is in particular what I believe has been eating the lunch of the combat vet community, is the only thing that's ever talked about are the negative, dark, possibly deadly aspects of going through trauma and storms in life, right? Which you have to know where those pitfalls lie.
Of
So
course.
yeah, I mean, people say, hey, so there's this, and it's portrayed through television shows, through movies, that hey, if you go through something devastating, some type of loss, and it doesn't have to be a suicide bomb, it could be the loss of a loved one, heaven forbid, the loss of a child, a car accident, and you're walking with a limp for the rest of your life. There's all these stories out there that say after that, your life is going to be somehow less. And what's going to be in your future? Rage, relationship problems, self-medication, right? You're going to have a hard time holding down a job. You have to grow out your beard and walk around with a scowl on your face all the time, right? That's the message that's out there. So what happens is, I think unknowingly, when that dominates the conversation, what that does is it puts options in the medicine cabinet of people's minds. And then they do go through something and they're trying to just gut it out and make sense of it on their own. And they open up the medicine cabinet of their mind, and all the options that have been placed on there are negative ones, right? I
Mm.
think they say, I was told rage. Oh, man, I was told relationship problems. Now I got to tell my kid, if you see me napping on the couch, don't shake me awake. Oh, come up swinging. I've seen some stuff. They were told self-medication. Then they're like, where's that Jameson's? And it can become a negative and potentially deadly self-fulfilling prophecy. And what's not being talked about is anti-fragility, post-traumatic growth. The fact that, yes, pain in life is not optional. It is part of the deal. You're getting it. But long-term suffering is. That is something that you have agency in. And I don't think a lot of people realize that when you go through these storms, these traumas in life, and yes, some make a longer time to make sense of than others, that you can live a deeper, richer, more fulfilling life because of that thing, not in spite of it. You can use it as a springboard to a better life. Like if you go through a kinetic event, maybe not physically, maybe you're going to be missing a few bits or you have a few new scars, but where it matters most, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, in your relationships, how you enjoy life, your zest for life, you can actually be better off after that event than you were before it. Not in spite of it, but because of it. And that is something that I don't think is being talked about nearly enough.
Do you feel like you've learned a lot of these lessons? And I'm like jotting down basically everything you're saying here. It's all gold. But a lot of what you're saying here is it would be filed under mindset, expectancy theory, perspective, use great language, right? Self-fulfilling prophecy, I hear optimism, I hear hope, agency, internal locus of control. Like I can do something. Have you learned those lessons, say, in the decade so following, right? That probably the most, I think, traumatic event you would say. Did you learn them before? Were they kind of being built up throughout childhood, right? With some of those early messages? Like, how did you come by this sort of belief, which I think is scientifically accurate, that we do have some agency? There is something that we can do to exert perspective over our collective circumstances.
Yes. So a hard yes to some of those and a loose yes to some of those. Now,
Okay.
some of these things I wish had been packaged better to be more easily digested as part of preparation before going into harm's way. But we were not without preparation. So
Packaged
just
better by whom?
uh I think they should be packaged better by whoever sends you into harm's way. Like that's just my,
Okay.
that's 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 my opinion. I feel
Okay.
that if you're working on behalf of your nation and they send you forward, like there's I don't know who wrote this, but it's so true. There's two rules in any war. We're going to try to kill them and they get to try to kill us. That's it. Everything else is just a detail, right? So you're going into a war with, it's a war, right? You are sending men and women out there. Yes, running logistics is a job, delivering mail is a job. All these things have to happen when you're a very big force, but at the end of the day, you're going there to fight. And what does that mean? That means bombs. That means bodies getting blown up. Like that is the end result of what you are sending people. Diplomacy has failed, right? That's why we're there on the ground.
Hmm.
So it's just my opinion that the organizations that send men and women to go do that, they have a moral obligation to prepare them for that after effect, right? And we're very world class in preparing them with tool set and skill set on like how to go do it. But the education of mindset and heart set has been lacking. Now, the organization that sent me were very, very forward thinking. There was reading lists, we had conversations, we talked about, before we went, like why and purpose. And we would literally have to bare our souls to each other. And okay, what is it that you will fight through hell and high water to make it home to? Right? Tell us that right now because we're going to hold each other accountable because the mind and heart navigate the body. The body is never going to follow, or the mind and heart are not willing to lead. And we read Man's Search for Meaning, right? And
Sure.
Viktor Frankl, right, as you know, he says those who had a reason to live for beyond the prison walls had the greatest chance of living, meaning it has got to be about something greater than self. Because when you are living for something greater than self, whatever that may be, quitting is never on the menu, front or back. It is simply never an option.
So I want to ask you about that too. Obviously, having heard the story, I knew this was going to come up. Purpose. And you brought us to it right away. You started talking about having the idea of, I think, service seeded in you at a very, very young age, very intentionally, like you, to use your word, packaged very thoughtfully, it sounds like, right? Deliberately anyway. How did that develop over the course? I mean, was it just, from that point on, okay, we serve, I need to find something that is beyond myself, greater than myself? Did you not think about it in such a, I think, maybe kind of spiritual or meaningful way? Was it just, okay, family says I got to go into the military at some point, so I'm going, sort of deal? What was that like as a young person, especially?
Well, I wasn't really thinking about it on a deep spiritual level when I was young. It was more a family tradition that I was very
Okay.
enthusiastic. I was
Okay.
very enthusiastic to fulfill. Honestly, when I first went in, I mean, I entered into the army at 17 and a half and I turned 18. I was already done with training. I'm already a soldier at 18. So at that young age, people of my generation, we, cut our teeth reading, talking to there was a lot of World War II guys still around. There's only a handful of those guys left anymore.
Hmm.
talking to the guys who had fought in Vietnam. So I can say for me, it was a family tradition, but I didn't really assign any deep spiritual meaning to it. It was just like, hey,
Yeah.
I'm expected to go. I want to go. I'm happy to go. Let's do this.
Mm-hmm.
But then as I started, walking deeper and longer down the warrior's pathway, then I started to add in ethos to it, right? So that's when, okay, yeah, I'm here because it's my family expects me to go. But now when you get there, you realize, like our whole fighting ability is based upon camaraderie and looking out for the people to your left and your right, right? So that's something that really I never experienced at that level until I went into the military, right? Which is it's a different way of life, which I was enamored with. And not I don't want to say in the entire civilian world, but in the world at large, the main overriding mantra is if you don't have a family, it's look out for yourself, right? Like look out for number one, watch your back. You hear it all the time, watch your back, look out for number one, get yours. And when you're in a fighting unit, that's an unforgivable sin, right? You never just look out for yourself. So the basics of that is if me, you, and one other person go in to clear a house, right? I'm not just looking out for myself. I'm looking out for you, and I'm looking out for the other guy. So you and everyone's doing that. So each one of us have two people watching out for us with our best interest. But if we go in like a group of individuals, everybody just looking out for themselves. Now you only got one person looking out for you, right? And that a group like that will get picked apart. So that's one of the that's one of the comforting things about joining the military is when you go in there, especially if you're in a fighting unit where that is part of the culture and part of the ethos, there's just this feeling of safety and security no matter where you are at. You could be in the most dangerous place you can imagine. If you have a group of people that you've been through this pipeline with, you can feel like, whatever comes over that ridge line, we can handle it. Why? Because we're here together. So
Was some of that cultural for you and your family as well, that sort of communitarian sort of mindset?
it was, we're
Yeah.
like a lot of families, we were a close-knit family. We lived in a small house, very loving family, very, very open with our affection. Like my dad's passed, but he was living with me before he passed away. And still, in his late 70s, he would go to bed. He'd be like, Kawika, I'm going to bed. He'd come over and give me a kiss goodnight. That was just, we would never end a conversation in person without hugging, a kiss, and I love you. Never get off the phone without saying that. So, just a very tight family. So not everybody has that, right? I'm not saying that's good or bad, but for some people, they don't experience something like that until they go to, and it's not just the military. For some people, it could be a team, right? They could be a sports team or a youth group is where they feel that connection or that ability
Transcends the self. Yeah.
100%. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I was wondering, right? You had something early on that either implicitly or explicitly suggested there are things that are bigger than just you, Kawika, the individual.
That's right.
Yeah. Right. So you carry that into the military and then you find more of it.
Yep. Carried it, find more of it. And, the Army is a large organization. And like any large organization, you're going to have your workers and your non-workers, right? Like, I'm not saying that everybody in the military has this ethos or that everybody is a stud. It's not. It's just not the case. But you put yourself in units where that's just how things are, right? That's the ethos, that's the culture, and even within that, you surround yourself with people, and people, good people just gravitate towards each other. So
Right.
it was a very natural segue for me.
Hi friends, Nick here with just a brief interlude to share with you an update on one of our newest partnerships with the Antifragile Academy. Throughout John and I's conversations with many, if not most, of our guests, one thing has been made really clear. In order for people to flourish, thrive, experience the good life, they need to develop the capacity to not only navigate and endure, but ideally grow from the bad, grow from unpleasant experiences. That's why we're thrilled to be partnering with our newest sponsor, the Antifragile Academy, an organization that I co-founded with Dr. Adam Wright, Director of Mental Performance for the Washington Nationals. At the Antifragile Academy, we work with adolescent athletes, executives, and educators to help them understand some of the science, not just of optimal performance, but of well-being and anti-fragility. The ability not only to endure and bounce back from unpleasantness, but to actually come back stronger, to grow from it. Between Adam and I, we've worked with Fortune 100 companies, Inc. 300 executives, Division I programs, and elite professional athletes and Olympians from all over the world. To find out more about how you can leverage anti-fragility training, check out our website at theantifragileacademy.com. So by the time, right, you're going through your military career, law enforcement, right? By the time the suicide bombing occurs, right, and this tragedy happens, you've connected to, I think, what sounds like, you correct me if I'm wrong, and a clearer and clearer sense of purpose, right? Although the sources are becoming a little bit more diverse as well, right? And so I'm just curious, like at that point, and again, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I've heard you tell the story before, right? As you're laying there, wondering if you're going to make it or not, purpose is what you really grabbed onto, right? Like in the moment where you needed to be sort of most resilient, right? Potentially most anti-fragile, purpose was one of the things you really leaned on, correct?
Yes.
Do you see an evolution of that, like kind of a trajectory towards that purpose throughout the course of time?
Yeah. For me, it has evolved.
Mm.
So going back to that, like going back to the bang, right? Like I wake up, I'm in the middle of the street, I'm face down. And when I was patrolling, I had my interpreter, Zahor, was on this side, and my Afghan brother, Ghulam Saki, was on this side, and he was in charge of all operations in the city. Right. He was that sergeant major on the Afghan side. He was my counterpart. I was actually there to advise him. But I mean, there wasn't much I could teach this guy. Like he was just an incredibly, exceedingly brave, selfless human. So we were coming out of this park, and I literally just said to him, I'm like, man, this patrol couldn't be going any better. It was awesome. And there was no change in the atmospherics in the air. There was no, like, all the markers that we look for, like, is this going to be a permissive environment? They were all there. So Afghanistan's a very ethnically fractured society. This is just one of them, right? So um, some of the ethnicities, if you put them in a room together, some get along just fine, but others, you put them in a room together, give them an hour, someone's getting stabbed. That's just how it is, right? They got feuds that go back before Alexander the Great was there, right? And we're not going to solve them. So, but typically on market day, which in this city was a Thursday, they kind of got this unwritten rule, like, hey, like we're all coming to the city to get things that we don't have in the village, so let's just be chill, right? Like
Okay.
nobody's
Okay.
shooting at each other, right? We need flour, you need flour, right? Let's go get it and then go back to our villages. Friday's their holy day, so Thursday's kind of like, hey man, let's just have a good, right? Let's just get along at least for this day when we're in market day. So when you go, if you're in the city on market day, one of the things you're looking for is everybody here, right? Are all the ethnicities present, young and old? Everybody was there. All good signs, old people, young people. So there was no sense of danger in the air. So that we're patrolling, and then the bomb detonated behind me, about 10 feet behind me, just threw me forward through this gate. Parts of my interpreter went through a fence, parts of my Afghan brother went through, the same fence. I got shot through the gate, landed on my face, and I woke up, and I knew exactly where I was. I just didn't know why I was sleeping, because it knocked me out. And I don't know how long I was out, but it was quite some time, because the pool of blood that I was laying in was immense. Like I could have did a complete blood angel, and it was all my blood. one of my right femoral artery was severed. Right femur just got blown right out of my leg. Left leg was barely attached at the knee. So I knew I had at least one arterial bleed. Come to find out my brachial artery was severed too, but I just couldn't see it.
Mm.
Anyways, I flip myself over and I'm putting my tourniquets on with my left hand because this hand was just, it was like almost completely degloved. So I'm tourniqueting myself with my left hand and I keep passing out. I mean, the loss of blood, I was just having a very hard time staying awake. And despite all my efforts, I would find myself like just keep waking up again and again. So I was passing out. And once I got my tourniquets locked down, I knew I'm like, my rifle was blown off me. My radio was blown off me. I could hear shooting. I had my pistol was still on me, but I couldn't. This hand was completely in up. I couldn't use it. I couldn't cross draw because this shoulder was dislocated. It was like way down here, and I couldn't reach across my body to get my pistol out. And I remember my mind was like, do the lethal weapon trick. And I remember, I think it was Lethal Weapon 2 and Mel Gibson. They put him in a straitjacket and they like throw him in the ocean and he dislocates his shoulder because it was a bad shoulder and that's how he gets
Sure.
out. So I remember that moment, and I was trying to roll out of my shoulder to get it back in the socket somehow, and it wasn't working. And so for the smallest moment, because I knew my partner Matt was on the other side of the city, I said, I know that he heard this bomb go off, and I know that if him and the other guys are alive, they are running full throttle right here to save the day. I'm like, my tourniquets are locked down. There's literally nothing more I can do. I was trying to shout at guys, but I kept passing out. So for the smallest moment, I thought, you know what, man, this is bad. Like, I could just close my eyes, take a nap, and let myself get rescued. Like, wake up and be someplace nice like Kandahar or Bagram, right? Like in a bed. But as soon as I thought that, I thought, you know what? You know what that nap is if you take that nap? That's a dirt nap. Like, you are, like, homie, you are not waking up in this life.
Mm.
So I knew I had to have a reason. Like, my mind knew, like, it had to have something. Like, I'm in the quicksand and my mind needed a rope to like pull itself out to
Yeah.
keep myself awake. And my mind, like a laser, just took me to the day I left my house. I was living in Olympia, Washington at the time. The day that I left my house, 16-pack vans coming from the unit to pick us up and take us to SeaTac, and off we go. Sun is hours from rising, and I'm walking around the house in uniform, drinking out of my favorite coffee cup, looking at all the projects in the house that are going to have to wait till I come home. My mom's there to see me off. And her and my wife are, my mom's just bawling, right? Like, and my wife, she's from a place that, had a lot of war refugees. Like, so she's no stranger to war. Um, so they come out and I'm like, hey guys, I'm like, Van's going to be here any minute, hugging on them, loving on them. And both my wife and my mom, they're like, hey, they said, promise us that we're going to see you again. They're like, you promise us before you walk out that door that we will see you walk back into that door. And I couldn't make that promise because I had been to too many funerals during this war of friends of mine who were the baddest mofos walking around. And they came home in a box wrapped in our flag. So I know sometimes, despite all of your best preparations, it's war. It goes down like that, right? So, but I did promise them, I said, if something happens that will keep me from coming home, I will fight, I will stab, I will claw my way through anything that will keep me from coming back to you guys. And I said, and if I come back in a box wrapped in our flag, I said, I want you to know I made them pay one hell of a tax. And they said, all right, you promised us. And I was in that moment thinking about taking a nap lying in that street. My mind in living color went right back to that moment. And to be honest with you, I got mad. Like, I looked around. At that point, the only people that I knew were dead were my interpreter and my Afghan brother. Everybody else, I from where I was laying, I couldn't see them. Some of them I could see, and they weren't moving, but I didn't know if they were just still knocked out like I was.
Sure.
But I got mad. I mean, I thought, I'm like, none of these SOBs trying to kill us got the right to make one tear roll down the cheek of anybody who loves us. And in that moment, I thought, I myself was not afraid of dying. And people say, if you say you're not afraid of dying, you're a liar. I don't believe that because I have worked with many people who I know they themselves had no fear of dying, but they did have a healthy fear of what would become of me if they died and they weren't there to watch my back, or what's going to
Mm.
happen to their families if they have a family, right? What's going to happen to them if they don't come off that street? And that is what they're fighting for. And in that moment, even laying there, I was just thinking how much it would crush them. Christmas rolls around, my seat's empty. Thanksgiving rolls around, my seat's empty. Who's going to walk my daughter down the aisle? Like who's going to, when one day when my boys get married, who's going to tie their tie? Like I want to be there, right? And they want me there. And that's what I fought to stay awake for. Like I said, the day got long at that point. I was scooped up by Afghans and thrown in the back of a truck and off I went. But in that moment, that was my sole purpose of staying alive, was just to let them see me again. And this is something I've also learned. I had some loose ends in my life that I didn't realize until that point. There were some things that were left unsaid. There was forgiveness that, for selfish reasons, I had held out from granting to people that wanted it from me, just being a jerk. I don't know why people do this. But in that moment, like all these things were just flooding my mind. And I'm like, my God, like I have got to live. Like I have got to, there's a lot of people that I have to ask forgiveness for. There's people I got to give forgiveness to. And I got just too many loose ends in my life to go out right now like this. Right. Like I've
Mm.
got to make it home, right? To do some things that I should have done before I left.
It's really amazing. I can't, to what extent does, we're talking about purpose, right? Which is kind of a subtopic, if you will, of meaning, often associated with spirituality.
Mhm.
What role, if any, does spirituality play, or did it play in that moment?
Huge. I mean, and if you take like spiritual purpose, a couple other things, it's like a Venn diagram, right? There's going to be
Sure,
there's going to
sure.
be a lot of overlaps. So number one, we kind of knew what we knew that there were suicide bombers in the city. Like this group that we were pursuing, um, they did a lot of suicide bombs. So we knew this was a distinct reality. So we had pre-programmed our OODA loops. When there was down moments, we would go up to each other like, "Hey, listen, tomorrow you're in the city. You wake up, you have no legs. Tell me how you win." Like we were pre-programming our neural pathways, every day leading up to this point, so that if something did happen like that, it would take almost no cognitive bandwidth to solve this problem. It's like driving a route home you've driven home, 100 times. So, but even so, when I was in that moment, I knew just as soon as I woke up and saw all the blood that I was laying in, I knew, I'm like, my body is probably at the tipping point of what it can endure. Like every physical organism, it has its limits, and then what we know is that the mind can push that threshold back, right? Like that will to live,
Sure,
that fight.
sure.
I knew I had that, but I knew that my body also had its limits. But I'm gonna push it till the wheels fall off. But in that moment, laying there, I mean, I don't want to get weird on you, but from a spiritual standpoint, I saw some things that I don't want to bring any mysticism into this, but I
You
have
bring whatever you need or want to bring into it. Yeah, where it's your story. I'm
I have
curious.
I have two older sisters. I'm one of seven. By that point, two of my older siblings, two of my sisters, had passed away young, and when I'm laying there, I wake up, when I'm doing my tourniquets, and it was just as real could be. They were both there. They,
Mhm.
they were both there, like holding my head, Christy and Jeannie. And it was so real to me. I'm like, this makes perfect sense. I'm like, I'm about to die and you're here to take me to heaven. Like it was so real. I mean, I didn't even doubt it. I'm just like, oh, I'm like, they sent you. I'm like, hey, you know what? This is, I want to live, but obviously if you're here, and one of my sisters says, she goes, it's not your time yet. And I mean, that's hard for some people to sink their teeth into, but that was as real to me as I'm sitting here talking to you. And in that moment, I knew I was going to live. Right. And so I never panicked. I knew like this isn't my time. like nothing, like I am going to make it out of here. I still have a role to play in this, I've got to do my part, but I felt like, my survival and me coming home, like that was already written, because what we know kills a lot of people in those moments is, shock, panic, right? And a lot of that can be attributed to lack of mental preparation. When you are in a situation and you never expected to be in that situation, it takes a while for your OODA loop to spin up, right? And you can die during that time, or you can be simply overwhelmed by events and not do anything to save your own life. But like in all things, like, uh, all things high risk, right? Climbing, surfing, anything high risk, you got to be completely in the moment, right? You can't panic, right? You have to keep your wits about you. So um, I felt this peace, even in that there were still rounds being fired, but even in the middle of that, I just felt this peace, like I'm going to be fine. Even though my leg was turned inside out, my femur was gone, and I was in the state I was in. I just felt, you know what, I'm going to be fine. And then for a brief moment, when they threw me in the back of a truck, they grabbed my medic, Austin Weigel, and threw him on top of me. And I'm trying to like grab the roll bar and grab him because that truck's about to take off and he's still dingling out the back. And then somebody took a picture of that, click, and that was front page border to border color on the cover of the Wall Street Journal, sitting in my driveway
Oh,
before the paper.
wow.
I've got like 10
Oh,
copies.
wow.
I've got like 10 copies of that paper. So that truck takes off and we're both getting, like, his feet aren't even in the back of the truck yet. So he's getting pulled out and this driver's just driving like a maniac, right? Trying to get us somewhere. So, with my bony claw hand, I grabbed the roll bar and I got him by the plate carrier to try to keep us from getting pulled out. And he is as white as this. I mean, he is just what, and I'm trying to do an assessment on him, and I see no blood on him at all. Well, he had a tension pneumothorax, a little piece of frag from the bomber's vest came above his side plate, penetrated his thoracic cavity, went through his lung and lodged in his heart sac. So he was having atmospheric air was rushing into his thoracic cavity. It was crushing his heart. It was collapsing his lung, and it was, crushing his heart. So he's in my lap and we're taking off, and I'm, trying to do what I can to him, assess him. I can't do much. And he looks up at me, and like in a war movie, he's like, "Lau, I'm gonna die." And I'm like, "You're not gonna." I'm like, "Dude, you are not gonna die." I'm like, You're gonna be fine." But in my brain, I knew he was dying in my lap, right? Like I'm like,
Mm.
he's dying, like right here in my lap. There's nothing I could do for him. So Bunts flying in the back of that truck, I just started praying over him. I started praying over him, and then we got separated like that. Another American vehicle came up, and that truck slammed on the brakes, and the Afghans in the truck pulled Austin off me and gave him to the Americans. But the Americans didn't. I was like sucked up against the cab of the truck, like so. That QRF never saw me, and as soon as the Afghans gave them my medic, they just took off with me in the back of the truck. And when they took it off, I'm like, "What about me? I'm still here."
Jeez.
But when I handed him off, when they took him off me again, for him too, I felt he's going to make it. Like he's going to be fine. Spirituality means different things to different people, and I don't have a strong, what you would call like overtly religious faith.
Sure.
So my grandfather, Kawika Lau, he was a Buddhist. He was born a Buddhist. He had to convert to Catholicism. That was one of the requirements because my grandma was Catholic. So in order for
Okay.
him to have her hand in marriage, he had to convert to Catholicism.
Okay.
And he also had to own like so much land. He had to own he had to prove that he could take care of her, right? And he was going to, raise whatever kids they had in the Catholic tradition. But he would still go to temple. He would still do Buddhist things. And one of my uncles before my grandpa died, he interviewed him. He goes, the interview, he said, "Dad," he goes, "we know that, you converted to Catholicism to marry mom." They're like, "And you take us to mass, but you also still go to Buddhist temple." They're like, "What?" They're like, "Dad, what are you? Are you Buddhist? Are you
Mm-hmm.
Catholic?
Mm-hmm.
Like, are you both?
Mm-hmm.
What's going on?" And in the interview, my grandpa answers in a very old old man Chinese way, right? He answers with like a story. He goes, well, he says, when somebody does something wrong to me, he says, my Catholic teachings tell me to turn the other cheek and forgive. He said, my Buddhist upbringing tells me to look within and see, have I done something in this life that will carry over to the next life to cause this offense? He said, but the Chinaman in me demands revenge. I like a non-answer. So, anyways, I wasn't raised in a religious household, but I sought faith on my own. I sought spirituality, on my own, and I'm a believer, and
Okay.
and that's what I was leaning on,
Okay.
during that time and during my recovery. That was
Yeah. Yeah.
definitely one of my pillars.
So I want to kind of summarize here what I think I've heard kind of thematically throughout our conversation, right? I've got I think a series of like pillars or contributors to sort of your anti-fragility, if you will. I want to see if you agree with them. And then my next question is going to be how, if at all, do you intentionally try to weave these things into the way you parent? Because a lot of what you've shared starts with that T, the trauma piece,
Mhm.
right? And so, how do we help prepare our young people without necessarily exposing them to those things that could potentially be really harmful, right? And what that
Yes.
balance or that sweet spot looks like. So here's what I think I've got. Number one, there's a we component: service, purpose, community, transcending the self, right? There is a huge part of Kawika that is living for others, right? In some way, shape, or form. Number two, principles. And these are in no particular order. Principles are what we might call values. They orient you, they help you figure out if you're behaving the way that you want to behave or not, right? If you're in line with that, coherent, well-being, life satisfaction, fulfillment, you're not in line with that, you got problems typically. Okay. Number three, mindset. How you look at things, the perspective you take, right? The narrative you tell yourself inside your head, looking for the positive sometimes, but being willing to take on the negative or the unpleasant. Number four, spirituality. Not necessarily the same thing as religiosity. Our audience will know episode 16, Dr. Lisa Miller. The two are different. They're different,
Mhm.
right? But that spirituality, however it exists for you, which is in the form of faith, big deal. And then number five, it sounded like wholeness: mind, body, spirit, intellect. You're trying to focus on the entire me, the entire system, not over indexing on one particular component. Does that summary feel right to you?
Yeah, and there's a lot in that stew, but I think all those ingredients are elemental. Right? Like you can't, if you remove any one of those ingredients, any one of those pillars, the stool falls over. It doesn't work.
So
Um,
how do you try to help cultivate them or craft them in the lives of your three children, or maybe particularly the two oldest ones? Maybe it's not happening for the 3-year-old yet, but because
yeah,
certainly, I love you're welcome to give her a shout out or not, but I love the story of your daughter and everything she's got going on in the wrestling world. Feel free to tell that, but it just seems like you're not going about parenting them accidentally and leaving some of these things out, given they've been really important lessons for you.
that's right. So how you and I were raised as kids, right? So like people of our generation, the average age, and I got this from a book written by Jonathan Haidt called The Coddling of the American Mind, right? He writes
Sure.
in there, for people of our generation, the average age when you were let out, meaning your mom and dad were like, you and your friends get out of the house. Like, we don't want to see you till supper's on the table. And they didn't know where you were. They didn't care. Like you could have been in the backyard, you could have been down the road. They didn't know, they didn't care. But but when supper was on the table, you found your way back. For people of our generation, that approximate age was 6, right? 6 years old. And that's exactly what it was for me. I had a motorcycle. I didn't, half time I didn't wear a helmet. I had a Suzuki JR50. I'd crank that thing up at 6. And I'm like, I would not get my 6-year-old on a motorcycle and let him ride around without a helmet.
Sure, sure,
But we
sure.
did, right?
Yeah,
So, and also every generation, right? Our goal is for our kids to have it better than we had, to have things that we didn't have. But the
that's
same,
the hard part, right? That's the
how
hard
do
part. That's the tension. Yeah.
how do you keep them grateful, right? How do you
Mm.
keep them, how do you keep them humble? How do you keep them grateful. Like my father did a fantastic job providing for us. Even so, there were nights when we went to bed hungry. He was manual labor and he was too proud to ever take a dime of welfare. He would just wouldn't do it. He was like, for better or for worse, that was how the man was. So there were nights when we didn't have food. Like you would literally go to bed with an empty stomach. And my kids have never experienced that. So how do we, still teach these lessons? Because that's where you develop a lot of this resilience. So I do things. So for one thing, I give them as much free reign within reason as I'm comfortable, and sometimes I'm even uncomfortable. So now they're older, but even when they were young, like man, I let them make sure that they know how to do things safely. But I encourage them, hey, get on your bike, go for a ride, take off, go explore something, go back in the green belt. They have machetes, they have hatchets, go build a fort, do some things back there, get dirty. I'm not a big rule guy, but one of my rules is you're at the dinner table every night for dinner. Like, I don't care what's going on. This is, I'm home from work. Like, this is when I get to get my hands on you and we talk. And I tell them, you will be at the dinner table for dinner every night. And they love it. And I'm like, bring whoever you want. So a lot of times it's, not just them, it's their friends.
Yeah.
And we talk about things and we talk about philosophy. I've introduced them to Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, right? We talk about some of those lessons learned. We talk about events going on in the world, right? When COVID happened, we talked about, remember the first few months of COVID, everyone was like, is this the next Ebola? If you get it, do you die? Like when it was full of unknowns, and there's just this permeation of fear that was all over the world. I said, hey, do you guys know what's going on with this? And I said, a lot of people are afraid. Are you guys afraid? They're like, no, Daddy, we're not afraid. Okay, a lot of people are. Why aren't you afraid? And they're like, because we're gonna win in the end. Like we'll be fine. So just conversations like that. With uh, they work out. So I try to parent them and the whole person concept: physical, mental, emotional, spiritual.
That's what
So
it sounds like. Similar. Yeah, similar to what you received. Yeah.
like every morning before school, they work out. So I'm lucky. I have a friend who owns a gym, and he trains these kids. So I wake them up every morning at 6 a.m. 6:30. We're out the door. I drop them off. They work out. He takes them to school. So Monday through Thursday they're getting trained. They're lifting weights. So physical, right? Mental. I've put them in both of them, what I feel is the hardest scholastic sport in America, which is folk style wrestling, right? It's grueling. They're on a tough wrestling team. I put my daughter in that, right? Like there was a lot of, if you know anything about that sport, there are a lot of tears. Like I don't care how good of it is, like you're going to come up against the hammer. There's a lot of tears, and you have to learn how to take your lumps. You got to learn how to lose. And because it's not, when you're on the mat, if you don't get your hand raised, you can't point to any teammate and say you missed that block or you didn't do this. No, you can only go like this. Like I got beat. Like that other wrestler was better than me. I got beat. Like you have to
Mm-hmm.
accept, right? There's a lot of growth in that. Spiritual, we cover that. We believe, we attend church together. We do Bible studies together. And then I try to raise them to be very emotionally healthy kids. So that was something that we were a very affectionate family when I was young, but I don't think a lot of families during that time, during our generation, we were kids. I don't think there was a lot of dinner table conversations on emotions,
Hmm.
right? I don't think there was a lot of talk on emotional intelligence and how do you use your emotions to make better decisions, right? So we have these discussions. Okay, something happened at school. Well, how did you feel in that moment? Why did you feel that way? Did you act upon it? Did you let it pass? So we have conversations like this, right? And also they've spent every summer of their youth overseas. My
Okay.
wife's family lives in Kosovo, so every summer
Okay.
they're in Kosovo, and in the village that my wife's family lives in, it's like it was here 3 generations ago. Like there's no such thing as bullying in those villages. Like
Hmm.
you want to play soccer with these rough street kids, and they think that they can bully you around. They're going to do it, and guess what? You're not going to do. You're not going to go cry and tell somebody. You have to handle it on your own. Now, some people may say there's good and there's bad in that, but I think there is some value in having having to deal with bullies, right? Like on your own without having mom and dad come in and iron. No, you can't smooth the road out for your kid their whole lives.
Mm,
Right? And I've heard this said, if you raise your children in a zoo, you cannot expect them to survive in the jungle. And the
mm,
real world is a jungle. I've worked a lot of my adult life overseas and mostly in like villages, and there's different cultures, and there's times when literally if you are perceived as being someone that can be taken advantage of, either physically, emotionally, that's what's going to happen to you.
mm,
I mean, you don't need to channel surf the news for long to see this is happening within nation states, right? If one nation feels that they can do something to another nation, they're going to do it. And that's the same way with a lot of people, right? So me as a, I feel that my job as a father is, protector, provider, mentor, role model, and educator. So everything that we know works, I share it with them. And my daughter remembers, like she used to help me out with my wound care. When I first came home, I was on a wound vac.
okay.
A
Yep.
lot of wounds, and she would, she still remembers. She would help, do so. This is nothing new for her. Like their first formative memories during the 3 years that we were in San Antonio. The San Antonio at that time had more walking wounded than Walter Reed. Like everywhere you look, because we had the best burn unit in the nation there. So everywhere you looked, people were melted, missing limbs, pushing wound vacs. And, this is during the time in Iraq when all these up armored vehicles were getting penetrated with EFPs. And when that happens, it turns that vehicle into an oven and you melt. And the first things that go are eyelids, lips, noses, and ears. Those all have to be rebuilt. So
Mm,
until those get rebuilt, people are walking around without ears, sometimes without noses, without lips, without eyelids, right? It's a shock to some people. But for my kids, it was just childhood, right? Like they were surrounded by it all the time. So they kind of have a different perspective.
sure. Well, listen, Kavika, we've need to start to wrap here, but this was really, really incredible in terms of the story itself. But you were so clear in the way that you've taken these lessons and that you're very intentional about how you integrate them into your parenting, which I think makes a lot of sense, but I hope will be really useful to our listeners as well. I love the quote about the zoo and the jungle. Makes a lot of good sense. So I want to kind of wrap us with one final question. It'll be tough, but relatively concise. You've covered probably 5, 6 different core areas, right, that are really important for your own well-being, your resilience, your anti-fragility, your performance, you name it, right? If you had to suggest something that is sort of most essential, most foundational as a starting point, right, for our listeners, what do you think it would be for you, and what's maybe a tip on how they might get started?
I often ask myself this question just to keep my compass calibrated. I try to start my morning with stillness and silence and set an intention for the day. And sometimes I journal this, but anymore I don't. I just say it out loud. And I'll say, why should I live a full and complete life? Like, just take it day by day. Like today, like what type of person do I want to be today? What version of Kawika Lau do I want to send out into the world today? And what do I want Kawika to do today? And when I frame it like that, it's not about me, right? It's yes, I want to live life to the fullest, especially as a way to honor all my friends who, have passed on. But how do you make this life count for something?
Hmm.
So I start my day by asking myself this question. What version of Kavika am I going to send to the world? Who can I talk to today? And why should I live a full and complete life? Right. And when I do that, it's a lot of the luxuries that we enjoy in life, when you boil them down, they're actually distractions, right? I would even call them thieves of time, energy, and creativity that really stop you from doing what you could do or becoming what you could become. I mean, it drives me crazy. I mean, the average, the amount of time that the average American, not just kid, but adult, like spends on their phone, right? And you're getting almost, yeah, but for the most part, they're getting zero ROI on that, right? You could be talking to somebody. I told you, I just came back from, I was in Vietnam for almost all of November. And you don't see a lot of that there, right? You see people talking to each other. They have this wonderful culture, especially in Hanoi, of like eating outside, right? So it's like everywhere you look, it's a family table, right? But people are engaging. They still have this sense of community and tribe that is palpable, and I hope they keep that, right? I hope that they keep a hold of that and realize how precious it is, because I see a lot of Americans are just isolating themselves, and they're putting themselves in silos, and they're doing it to themselves, and then it gets harder and harder to break out. So I start my day by asking myself, why should I live a full life today? What do I need to do today? Because no one on this earth is promised today, right? And I am still very cognizant of the fact that I feel like I'm still playing on house money, right? Like, my story should have ended April 4, 2012. And a lot of my friends, some of the very best Americans this country's ever produced, their physical lives did end that day, but mine did not. So one of the ways that I found to make sense of that is to go forward and do my best to make the most of every day. Realize that in every conversation I have with somebody, that could be the last conversation I have with them, you're building every moment that you share with your kids, you're building legacy, brick by brick. And you have a long day at work, you're tired, you're beat down, you come home, your kid wants to go outside and play catch with you. You can only use this answer so many times. Maybe later, I'm tired. And that child will realize that maybe later, I'm tired actually means it ain't going to happen. And they're going to stop asking. Right. So I keep that, like, I come home, of course, man, everybody's tired, right? Everybody just wants to like Netflix and chill. But now this is when my kids need me, right? This is my opportunity to be a father. So, come home, I talk about school, which I'm interested in, right? I get on the floor with my 3-year-old. I play Hot Wheels, right? And, just to be giving of yourself. And for me, I found out, for me, the recipe for happiness is this. I'm happy when I'm doing good things. And when I'm doing good things, meaning bigger than self, I'm happy, right? And this should be no secret, because, it's like we're relearning all these lessons. Viktor Frankl himself writes, meaning does not pursue happiness, but happiness does follow meaning, right? If we just chase pursuits to be happy for happiness' sake, there is no meaning in that. But when you pursue a life of meaning, for everyone's going to be something different, even in the most austere conditions, even with no food in your belly, happiness can find you, right? If you're doing something that's greater than self.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of science will back that up too. The meaning-based happiness versus that pleasure, pursuit of pleasure. Yeah. A paradox of pursuit, we would call it. So Kawika, this has been phenomenal. Really, really appreciative of the time. Certainly no pressure to, but if you want to shout out any websites or contact info, if people want to follow up with you or interact with you, you're welcome to. Otherwise, just thank you for the time and your knowledge and your insights and reflections on a pretty amazing story.
Yeah. I don't have social media, but I am on LinkedIn.
Great.
David Kawika Lau. David is my legal name. And I'll give a shout out to some awesome nonprofits that are doing great work in the vet community. One is the Warrior Surf Foundation up in Charleston. Another one is Task Force Hydro 1, based out of Jacksonville, Florida, and also Operation Surf out on the West Coast. So these are grassroots nonprofits that take veterans. You don't have to be a combat vet, and they use ocean therapy and just getting you out in the sunshine, teach you how to surf as a way to heal. But that's just the vehicle, right? Like, the real thing is to get them back in, get our arms around them, and reestablish that sense of tribe, which is what a lot of people miss once they leave the military.
Cool. Very cool. Yeah. Awesome shout outs. So again, Kawika, thanks for the time. We really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Doc Nick. Thanks for having me. Good to see you again.
Thanks so much for listening to Flourish FM. We hope you enjoyed the content. Please be sure to leave us a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to your podcast and on all major social media platforms.
And if you visit our website, flourishfmpodcast.com, you can sign up to our newsletter. We send out a weekly newsletter. First newsletter of every month, we share a long-form blog, and every newsletter, every week, we share highlights from our previous episodes. Please hit subscribe on our website.